Hello, my name is Carl Herzog. I'm the public historian for the U.S.S. Constitution Museum, and like a lot of us, I am anchored at home right now, which of course has me thinking about being pretty much anywhere but home. So I thought it seemed like a good chance for us to talk a little bit about being on the open ocean with U.S.S. Constitution, and in particular thinking about how we know where Constitution was on the world's oceans when she was there. And more importantly, how did the crew know where they were with no other land or sails in sight to keep track of their position on the ocean? And how is it that we're able to take that information the crew had and still make use of it today? So to do this, I thought we could take a look at a couple of the tools and methods U.S.S. Constitution used, and also show you ways that you can replicate some of those methods at home with activities that are available on the U.S.S. Constitution Museum's website. So, let's start and take a look at how the ship was recording, where it was, and how they knew where that was. So what we're looking at here is a typical page from the U.S.S. Constitution's deck logbook. This was something that was maintained and recorded every hour of every day, not only when the ship was underway and actually sailing offshore, but even when she was operating but at anchor or possibly at the dock. That means these books are a huge wealth of information for historians like us who were trying to figure out where the ship was and what it was doing at any given day when it was underway. Now, if you're looking at this going, I have no idea how to read that, you're right. It's a little bit difficult to make out. There's two reasons for this. One is that these are 200 plus year old handwritten documents in penmanship of the time period, which can be really difficult to make out. And frankly, it gets even worse when, in some cases, the handwriting, just as today, from sailor to sailor and person to person varied pretty widely, and you never really know what kind of chicken scratching you're going to come across when you turn to the next page. So it's a challenge sometimes to decipher this. Now, in the page that I'm showing you here, this can be even more difficult because this is actually an image from the microfilm of the original ship's logbook, which in this case is kept in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And so the microfilm can make it even harder to read if the exposure when it was taken wasn't accurate or slightly fuzzy. But you're in luck. While we as historians have to figure all this stuff out, decipher it, and make use of it, we've actually done so, and we've transcribed all of it into printed documents that you can actually download from the U.S.S. Constitution Museum's website. So, while we're still looking at the original, what kind of information do we have here, and what can we learn from about it? Well, there's actually a lot here. For starters, there are the three columns noted over here. H, K, and F, and then followed by the course and the wind. Now, this is really important information. This is the backbone of how the ship was navigating. Once they were outside of land, and even if they were within sight of land, the ship was relying on a method of navigation known as dead reckoning. Now, I once heard somebody tell me, yeah, dead reckoning, that's where you reckon you'll be by the time you're dead, if you have to rely on that method of navigation. No, quite to the contrary. It's searched for deduced reckoning. It's a deduction. You're using the information that you have readily available in the absence of any other input to tell you where you are and where you're going. And that information in a nutshell is time, speed, and distance. This is pretty intuitive to most people who have ever driven a car anywhere. If I'm going at 60 miles an hour and I go for an hour, how far have I gone? Well, 60 miles. The only remaining question is, in what direction did I go? So every hour they were checking the ship's speed and then recording it in the logbook along with the compass course that was being steered for that hour. So for example, on this day, and this particular log is from August 13th, just a few days before the ship encounters HMS Guerriere under Isaac Hull, and on the first hour, the ship was traveling 4 knots, and then under the aft we see 4 also. The F stands for fathoms. Now, a fathom is a measurement of distance that's equal to 6 feet. It's predominantly used for measuring the depth of the water, but in this case, as I'll explain in a second, it actually represents a fraction of a knot of speed. So why knot? What does that mean? Where does it come from? Well, the knot actually is reference to a nautical mile per hour, and it was measured using this tool. This is a chip log or a common log, and it is really simple. This one actually belongs to U.S.S. Constitution. It was made by Greg Germain, who is a scientist with the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. But you don't need to be a rocket scientist like Greg to figure this out. This is a ship speedometer that is used to measure how fast the ship's going. And here's how it works. The wooden triangular shaped piece gets thrown over the back of the ship. The idea behind the shape of that wooden chip is that it will sit in the water, blocked by the water, as the ship sails away from it. So the ship's moving, but you're not dragging the chip through the water. So as the ship sails away from it, the crew pays out the line off of the reel. Now along this line, it's knotted. They're literally little tiny knots tied at set intervals along the line. And they'll let the line run out for a very set amount of time. That set amount of time is usually 29 seconds, and they would measure it by a pre-calibrated sand glass that ran for that amount of time. When the 29 seconds was up, they would stop the line from reeling out and haul it back in. They haul it back in, and they count the number of knots that have reeled off while they were doing that. And that number of knots is calibrated to the amount of time on the sand glass so that each knot that went over the transom of the ship represents a knot of speed, a nautical mile per hour that the ship was traveling. So, there's their measurement of speed. Now, we know how fast they're going by knots. The fathoms, in this case, actually represents a fraction of a knot. The distance between the tied up knots on the line was usually 48 feet, or 8 fathoms, 6 times 8 being 48. So if when they stopped the line, it wasn't exactly at a knot, but like halfway between a knot or a quarter of a way or a third of a way, they would measure that distance of that last segment in fathoms. How many fathoms between the two knots reeled out over the side? And in this case, on our first hour of this day, it was 4 knots and 4 fathoms. So 4 fathoms of line is equal to halfway between the knots. This means that the ship was traveling at 4.5 knots of speed. They would do this every hour, letting it reel out and then hauling it back in. It's actually a lot of work just to figure out what speed you're going, but it was really critical to this method of navigation to have an accurate sense of how fast you were going at each time. So, once they had that accurate measurement of speed, then they could combine it with the course that they had traveled in for that hour, and knowing where they started at, they could plot out on the chart where they went the next hour. So using just that method alone, the ship could keep track of its position across the open ocean with no other information coming to it except what they're generating themselves. How fast are we going? How long did we go at that speed? And what direction did we travel in? But they didn't have to rely on that completely. They also each day were measuring latitude using the height of the sun above the horizon. This is a once a day thing. You would go out and measure the height of the sun above the horizon when it reaches its highest point in the sky at local apparent noon, or high noon as people like to think of it. And they would do that with this tool. This is a sextant. This particular one is a Gedney King sextant. It is located in the U.S.S. Constitution Museum's collection. And this tool would allow you to very accurately measure exactly how many in degrees and minutes, portions of a degree of angle, the sun was above the horizon. That information could be translated into their latitude, or how far north and south they were, how far north of the equator the ship was at that hour. Now, on our logbook, we notice that it said latitude observed for each day, but not longitude. So the method to figuring out how to determine longitude at sea was one of the central questions of the 1700s, and by the time U.S.S. Constitution is sailing in the War of 1812, the problem has been solved, but it's a pretty complicated solution that involves not only having a chronometer, a mechanical timekeeping device, but also doing a pretty significant amount of math on board to keep track of it and solve the problem. And for travel in the Atlantic, North and South Atlantic Oceans, like Constitution was doing for its time period in the War of 1812, they weren't at sea long enough or far enough that that was always necessary. And as a result, a lot of times we don't see longitude observed by celestial methods and recorded in the logbook, except for a little bit later on in the War of 1812 and later on in the ship's history and career. For the most part, they were relying exclusively on a daily check of latitude and then the progress that they were making using that dead reckoning method. Now, if they knew a beginning point and end point, they could estimate their longitude by triangulating the distance that they traveled and seeing what latitude and longitude that would have put them at, and frequently that is recorded that way as well too. But they weren't actually determining it using any other sources. So with all those detailed recordings, we are able to sort of reconstruct where the ship was located at any given time during her cruises during the War of 1812. And we've actually done that and kept it on the U.S.S. Constitution Museum website. If you go to our website under Discover and Learn, you'll see the 1812 Cruises section, and there you can look up and explore through a series of interactive maps where the ship was, but you can also download a typed transcription of the entire logbook. Taking a look at each voyage, you can see where the ship began and where it went during the course of its three major war cruises. Now, in this case, what we're showing here is the very beginning of the war. Isaac Hull has command of the ship. It is up in Washington, D.C., and upon the declaration of war, the ship begins making its way out of the Chesapeake to the open ocean, working its way up the New Jersey coastline, escaping from a large British squadron, and eventually coming into contact with HMS Guerriere off of the coast of Nova Scotia, before then successfully and victoriously heading back to Boston. We have outfits like this and maps set up like this for each of the three cruises, as I said, and you can explore where the ship was, what it was doing at that time, and see some of the imagery associated with where it was going. Now, once you've done all this and you've had a chance to read the logbook, perhaps you'd like to construct and think about the ways the ship was navigating using some of your own tools and methods. So the sextant that we were talking about that was used to determine latitude is a pretty delicate instrument and could be pretty expensive. But you can make something similar at home that you could be really simple and help you do the exact same kind of thing to measure the angle of the height of objects, stars, or even the sun above the horizon to help begin to think about your latitude and where you are. And we actually have directions on the U.S.S. Constitution's Museum website for an activity that will do just that. On the museum's Fun and Games page, if you scroll down, you'll see an activity book that includes a wide range of activities, and among the hands-on activities, in fact, the first one is called Become a Navigator, and it provides you with directions on how to essentially make what amounts to a sextant at home with tools that your kids, if they're students, may already have. They involve simply a straw, a plastic protractor that measures angles, a string, and a weight. And with those four things, you can actually make a sextant yourself. Now, it wouldn't be one that you'd want to use offshore because it's relying on the weight and the string and gravity to provide a point of reference. And if you were on a rolling deck, that would be a little bit difficult to use. But it can certainly help you out in terms of determining latitude outside. So, Take a walk, record what direction you're going if you have a handheld compass, how fast you think you're walking and how far you've walked, and then use your homemade protractor sextant to see if you can determine the latitude that you've ended up with, or just out in the backyard doing it. I hope that's fun and helpful and provides you with some indication of how U.S.S. Constitution navigated without having to go out onto the open ocean yourself. If there's other topics that you'd like to see us talk about or things that you have questions about, don't hesitate to post it to any of the museum's social media, and we'll incorporate it into future videos. Thanks a lot.